Hello, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives 2, and also on Facebook at McDuff. And we are delighted to get back together with our good friend Harley Schlanger from over there in Germany. So, Harley, it's great to have you back. I don't think it's been at least a month since we were together because of traveling and other obligations. So I'm just delighted to have you back and get caught up with you. How you doing?
Doing pretty well. I need a vacation from my vacation. Taking
Oh,
three, we took our three young children to America. Our youngest daughter had never been to the United States, and she hardly slept. She was just running around everywhere trying to figure out what was going on. And my son, who was born in the United States, was also totally wired the whole time. So by the time we got back, I was ready for a vacation.
I understand that. So, yeah, well, with the kids, it's different, I think. But we had a great time. We were in Ireland, so you and I probably crossed each other in the middle of the Atlantic at some
Yeah,
point. And but we had the
probably.
most wonderful weather in Ireland. I mean, people were worried about the weather in Britain, and obviously that did cause a lot of distress and problems. But in Ireland, it's a different story. They're delighted with with some warm weather over there, and everybody was quite happy. And the sun was out for like 8 days straight. It was pretty amazing, and we
Uh,
got to
sounds good.
dig into some old family roots as well as more because they're celebrating or observing, maybe I should say, the 100th anniversary of the Civil War there, which is and then they're also still have the 1916, which we spent a lot of time in Dublin going over the events of the Irish rebellion of 1916, so-called Easter Rebellion.
Right.
Got to know a person whose grandfather was one of the leaders that got killed in that. So
Hmm.
it became a personal story that my wife and I got interested in and walked around the historic places. And the big observation is that it doesn't seem that the Irish government is interested in preserving and portraying that history. It seems like they're kind
Hmm.
of letting these anniversaries go by, and it's the local people that will do something about it. So, okay. Well, here's a question from the chat. I usually don't take them, but it's right on point. So let's just pose this question from Oswald Spengler. Does Mr. Schlanger have any thoughts on being placed on Zelensky's blacklist and also on the bombing of Daria Dugina? And I imagine that you do.
Well, those two things obviously are related because being put on a blacklist by neo-Nazi thugs is not exactly something that gives you a chance to relax. I mean, the obvious point is that I think they made a miscalculation because they listed initially 78 names, including fairly prominent people such as Ray McGovern, Glenn Greenwald, Scott Ritter, Tulsi Gabbard, Rand Paul. But 30 of the 78 people were people who had spoken at Schiller Institute conferences. And the second person on the list was Helga LaRouche. I was, I think, seventh or eighth on the list. There's another list that just surfaced today, or I just saw it today. It's from back in May, where I'm listed as a war criminal. And what happened is this guy, Shapovalov, who is in charge of the Ukrainian Center for Combating Disinformation, for those who don't know this, put out a list of people who are supposedly Putin mouthpieces, Russian operatives, committed to the destruction of Ukraine. And it's ironic because the one quote they had from me when they said I was committing information terrorism was when I said, I feel badly for the people of Ukraine because they're victims of their own government and NATO, which is using them as a battering ram against Russia. Now, I'm not sure that's a Putin talking point, but in any case, we've been advised by security that we should be on alert with this going on. Scott Ritter said he takes it as a badge of honor. Diane Sayre, one of my associates, who I think you had Diane on, she's running for U.S. Senate in New York against Chuck Schumer. She qualified for the ballot, which was an extraordinary effort to do it. You needed 66,000 signatures, or 45,000 valid signatures. She got 66,000. But putting her on a terror list, on a hit list, potential hit list, what's interesting is Schumer is one of the people who made sure that money went to the civil agencies in Ukraine, not just for weapons, but 1.7 billion went to agencies such as this Center for Combating Disinformation. And what Scott Ritter said in a joint appearance with Diane a couple of days ago is that Schumer is interfering with the election campaign of his opponent by using foreign proxies to issue threats against her. Now, I don't know if the New York Times will run that story. We probably won't see it come out in the United States press, but that's exactly what they're doing. They're creating a chilling effect by saying that if you even try to disagree with the official narrative, you're functioning as an agent of Putin. That's designed to silence people. It's the McCarthy era on steroids, especially because the Ukrainians, as we just saw, as it appears likely, according to the Russian Federal Security Police, that it was the Ukrainians who conducted the car bombing that killed Daria Dugin. So we also, I don't know if you saw this, John, you may have been gone when it came out, but the New York Times did a story identifying NATO special operations forces and US and British special ops teams training Ukrainian sabotage teams and assassination teams that are being deployed into the Donbass. So, for me, it's something you look over your shoulder once in a while. You try to make sure you're not in a dangerous situation, but more importantly, it's something that has to be combated. This is an evil. They don't want to have a discussion. And what is important is that we put out a release, and we got many of these 70-something people who were targeted to sign the release. It got out in the press in Greece and Italy. There was a parliamentary inquiry of the foreign minister of Denmark. It's been brought to the attention of Chancellor Scholz in Germany, and he's going to have to answer because there are 3 or 4 Germans on the list, including Helga, and I'm listed as German and American on the list. But by making it so public, we put a potential damage to the Ukrainians if they do act to harm someone, that it will become clear that they're the ones who would be involved in doing the targeting. Now, that may not stop them. I think they're losing the war in spite of what the Western media is saying. I think a lot of people in the West are getting tired of being told by Zelensky that they're not giving enough aid when it's somewhere close to $40 to $60 billion so far. And we're seeing extreme effects of the sanctions starting to hit the populations of Western Europe and the United States. So we can talk about that also, but I thank the person for the question and the chance to be able to discuss this. You, by raising these questions and bringing them up, help provide protection. It's an ironic thing, but having it known that you're on this list is probably one of the things that gives you a certain advantage and protection. So I'm glad it's gotten out and some people have seen it.
Excellent. And the Dugina's story is, it's a tragedy, and it's also one of those events that looks like a terrorist act, in that is geared to intimidate people. And you guys have been intimidated. Now we see an attack on somebody that is, a child of the person that was probably the target, as an assault on the whole nation. It seems like if I was a Russian, I would feel personally assaulted by that. And even as as just a citizen of the world, I have to question how is it possible for the Russians to have amassed a sufficient amount of evidence. I mean, they've got the videotape, they've got the materials involved, and they can make their assessment. And for the Western press and governments to just completely ignore their assessment and just blithely put out a little, blurb that says, daughter uh, of Russian nationalist assassinated in car bomb, as if these things happen every day.
Well, look, the narrative about Russia is that there's some hint in some of the media that maybe Putin did it because he's not completely happy with Alexander Dugin. There's also the possibility, they're raising this as a possibility, that it could have been some military people who don't think Putin's been tough enough on Ukraine, and they're trying to force his hand. They're all, this is all speculation. What we do know is that they have tracked some things down. They're going to be very thorough. There probably will be some reaction, but I think the first thing they're going to do is say to the world, this is state-sponsored terrorism. Are you going to do something about it? Now, the answer is probably no, because look at what's happening around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. It's clear the Russians aren't shelling the plant. That was the initial story, because there were Russian soldiers there. Secondly, the Russians say they don't have heavy weapons there. They're not using it as a shield. They're there to protect the plant because it's a major producer of electricity for Ukraine. And yet, Zelensky says the Russians are there with heavy weapons. They're shelling from there. Zelensky gave that report to a number of these European leaders. And then they said, well, we can't let people go there because it's not safe. The Russians are saying if you get safe passage through the part of the area next to it that's run by Ukraine, we'll ensure your safety once you get there. So what's the media say? Russia doesn't want the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors to come in. So what we're dealing with is the most intense hybrid warfare, what they call information warfare, or we were just having a discussion last night with some experts on this. I can report some interesting things on it, but who controls the narrative? The RAND Corporation did a report in 2019, which was titled, Who Controls the Narrative? And it was essentially expecting that Russia was going to do something at some point and blame the West. So they're well prepared for this. And this is one of the areas of British psychological warfare. So what we're seeing, John, is hypocrisy. We're seeing lying. We're seeing the West sticking to the idea that we're going to keep pouring in arms, keep supporting the Ukrainian forces down to the last Ukrainian. Zelensky's been told not to negotiate. So, is this going to be a long war? Well, if you have the proof that this was done by Ukraine to kill Dugin, and by the way, let me just say one other point on Dugin. The Western media keeps saying this is Putin's brain, that this is the guy who's telling Putin what to do because he's a hardcore Russian nationalist, and now Putin is gravitating toward that. Putin has always been a Russian nationalist. He doesn't need someone like Dugin to tell him what to do. There's not even much evidence that they had any close relationship. The fact that you have a really hardcore Russian nationalist faction, which is much more committed to using weapons to destroy Ukraine than Putin. Putin has been very patient and has held the military back to conduct the military operation as he sees fit, namely to degrade Ukraine's military and get the neo-Nazis. So there's just so much in the form of information warfare that's out there, and you just can't believe anything you read in the Western media.
You mentioned Scott Ritter and a number of other folks that are watching this war very, very closely, Ray McGovern and others. And I certainly do enjoy their perspective and their commentary. The war itself, it doesn't seem to be really going anywhere very fast. Just the Russians are taking a few kilometers here, a few kilometers there, and that's been going on for a couple of months now. The impending winter is going to become a factor pretty soon. And I wonder what's going to happen if, see, a large area of the Donbass province that the Russians are trying to protect and secure is still under the control of the Ukrainians. And I and everybody else, I think, would like to see this war over with before the fall, before the winter.
Mm-hmm.
But what are the prospects if this war drags through the winter? And in particular, you're there in Germany, in Berlin, and the kind of uncertainty of the German government right now is also a big factor. How are you doing as far as the cost of fuel? Are you looking at, are you still thinking it's going to be a big disaster? And what do you think is going to happen is, I know you're not a military analyst, but you've talked to a lot of military analysts. Do you see the war dragging through the winter and into next year?
Well, here's the point that's been made recently by Scott Ritter and Douglas, Colonel
McGregor.
Douglas McGregor, yeah. And some others. What they're saying is that it's going to be a slugfest for a while, because Ukraine does have a pretty well-trained army, a large army. They have been preparing for this. They dug themselves in. The area that they're still holding in the Donbass is somewhat reminiscent to World War I trench warfare. Their capability to protect themselves and hard shells to protect the ammunition and communications and so on. But they have no strategy for victory. And they're hunkered down, and we saw what happened in the Avastal plant. Eventually, the Russians are going to get them. Now, the question of how long it lasts, this is the intent of NATO, the British, and the people around Biden, is to drag this out as long as possible, to weaken Russia as much as possible. Now, let me just call attention to what Putin said at the Moscow International Security Conference last week, which I think is the more important factor. The question is, how long can the West hold out? How long can the West continue to pour arms into this, pour money into it? What's going to happen when you have a hot autumn because of economic crises hitting the West? And let me just give you a couple factors there. The Bank of England forecasts that inflation in the United Kingdom will hit 13% by the end of this year. The analysts of the UK desk at Citigroup say it's going to be more like 18%. You have one of the largest ports in England right now is locked down by a strike, which is going to shut down freight shipments. It's going to make the connections and the supply chain much more broken up. You have the fuel prices are going to triple in the United Kingdom. They're talking about fuel poverty inside England. And someone said, well, people are going to have to choose between eating and heating. And one of the underministers was caught on record saying people may not be able to do either, the way prices are going to go up. Now, that's in the United Kingdom. In Germany, you have farmers preparing for an offensive once they finish the harvest in September. They're talking about every single day having tractorcades, having demonstrations, going out and talking to people. And the farmers are eliciting a tremendous amount of support from the population, because they're not greedy bankers trying to make a big profit. They're trying to make sure they can stay in business so they can feed people. And farmers, and it's my experience as someone who used to do a lot of farm organizing in the United States, farmers tend to be very moral. They see their job as a calling, especially those who represent family farms. So when you start having dock workers and farmers and truckers in the streets, and then you have the breakup of political parties, you have the collapse of governments. There's an election in the middle of September in Italy that will probably bring a center-right government to power. Now, the person who's leading that coalition, a woman named Meloni, says she's for the European Union, but most of her coalition partners, like Salvini and others, who are saying, well, we won't pull out of the European Union at first. I don't believe that. I think their intent is to pull Italy out of the EU because they've gotten such a bad hand from the EU. So the economic crisis is going to have a big effect in the West. Now, just go ahead to November 2022. What's going to happen in the elections? The so-called anti-inflation plan of Biden is not going to do a damn thing about inflation. It's going to make costs go higher because it's pushing the green agenda. It's much more of a green policy than an anti-inflation policy. The Federal Reserve is talking about raising interest rates more, which will probably at some point trigger a wave of defaults. And then when they start lowering it to try and build up the housing market again, because the housing market's in terrible shape in the United States, also with higher interest rates, credit card rates go up. That's going to affect consumer spending. So the economy is one of the wild cards, and the people advising Biden are going to try to use the crisis to force through the full imposition, I should say, of the Great Reset, which is taking away from elected governments the power to make fiscal policy and give to the same people who make monetary policy the policy to govern. Now, what happens then to your so-called democracies? So I think they're taking a big gamble by extending the war, especially the effect the sanctions are having on these countries. Now, the other factor, of course, is what's happening in the global south. We're seeing the countries that are being told you must support us against Russia are telling Blinken to go take a hike. The South African foreign minister, I think this happened since the last time we talked, the South African foreign minister said, we're a sovereign nation to Blinken. Don't come here thinking you can bully us to do what you want. The Indian foreign minister said the same thing. He said, we'll do what's in the interest of India, not what's in the interest for Washington and London. And then you had the Indonesian president, who was getting enormous pressure to keep Putin and Xi Jinping away from the upcoming G20 meeting, which is going to be in Indonesia. And he said, look, they deserve to be there. And if Zelensky wants to come, he can come also, but we're not going to tell Putin and Xi to stay home. So there's growing resistance from developing countries, the former non-aligned nations. And what's the form it's taking? They want trade. They want investment. They're not getting it from the West because the only thing the transatlantic countries are investing in is war and green technology. Countries in Africa want nuclear power. They want coal-fired plants. They want high-speed rail. They want upgraded dams and water management programs. They can't get that from Europe because Europe doesn't have the money to do it and doesn't want to do it. So we're seeing what Putin described as a transition to what he said is a new financial architecture, which is, of course, the term that we've been using for some time. So in the long run, I'm quite hopeful that the idiocy of people like Blinken and Sullivan and the leaders of the House and the Senate in both parties, that whatever they think they're doing is going to backfire. Just one other example. Can you imagine a 100-0 vote in the Senate to designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism? Now, what what Scott Ritter said in an interview the other day is it shows that we have 100 idiots in the U.S. Senate. And he endorsed Diane Sayre, saying we need someone who's not an idiot in the U.S. Senate. So I think some of these things will backfire. Now, the question is, how much will get through to the population? How much will people know? How much exposure do they have to the ideas that Russia and China are fighting for the same kind of sovereignty that a lot of the Trump supporters identify with Donald Trump? The idea of a national sovereign policy, which puts the interests of its population first, but also recognizes that other sovereign nations have interests and that we have to negotiate with them to give them a chance to fulfill that. So we have potential allies. And the role of the media is to convince Americans that the Chinese want to come and steal everything from us, that the Russians want to destroy Europe and rebuild the Russian Empire. And this is just poppycock. And anyone who knows history and anyone who knows anything about the actual wars that are going on knows that it's the US and NATO, which has been the aggressor since 1990. And just one final example of this, Syria. What happened in Syria? The US went in to overthrow Assad, to have a regime change against Assad, and gave weapons to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, who defended Syrian sovereignty? Putin and Russia. You don't think people in the Arab world know that? You know, the Saudis are a little bit hesitant to go all in support of what the West is doing now. So we're on the verge of what could be a great transformation in world history. What will determine it, I think, ultimately, is whether the American people wake up enough from this unipolar slumber, and whether the Europeans stop being so damn impotent and thinking they have to do, if Washington says jump, they ask how high.
I'm thinking about Estonia, and in context of Lithuania, which was the issue before I went out of the country, the issue of Lithuania, without any legal justification, blocking the railroad line from the Soviet Union into what do they call that city now? Kaliningrad.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that to me it's suspicious of a provocation. In other words, we're gonna poke you. You know, it was a poke against the West, saying, look what you can do. You can. I mean, it was a poke against Putin, I should have said,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and it was a poke against Putin to kind of try to get him to engage against Lithuania. Now it's very well known that this accused assassin from the Ukrainian armed forces, her escape route was directly to Estonia. And the reason that I bring those up is because we also have various stories coming out of Poland and other places that are right along the Soviet or the old Soviet border, the Russian and Belarus border. Is the attempt by NATO to get Putin to strike out somewhere other than Ukraine. Because if he would do that, then NATO's alarms are triggered, and they all have to go to war. So if there's any chance that NATO can provoke Putin into taking some action in Estonia or Lithuania or any of the other borderline former, pale type of countries, that I see it as a possible a provocation. Do you think that makes sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you look at Lithuania and Estonia, they're small countries. They're not threatened by Russia, but they're being used as the proverbial pebble in the shoe to try and force Russia to do something. I don't know if you remember from the 50s, the movie The Mouse That Roared. Did you ever see that? There's a movie about a poor country in Europe that couldn't survive, and so they just declared war against the United States so the US would come in and conquer them and then rebuild them. This is essentially what we're seeing with Lithuania, Estonia. They're talking about lining up with Finland and Sweden and turning the Baltic into a NATO lake, which implies cutting off Russian access through the Baltic to the North Atlantic. Now, this is all geopolitics. This all comes from the handbook of the British World War I strategy of pitting Germany against Russia, cutting off Russia from Europe, using Japan to prevent Russia from doing anything in the Pacific. That's what global NATO is about, the confrontation in the South China Sea, the Taiwan issue. It's all 19th century politics. And as Ritter and McGregor both said recently, it's 19th century politics enforced by a 20th century military strategy, whereas China and Russia have a 21st century military capability. And if you think about the idea of using, I think your father was in the Pacific during World War II, wasn't he?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. The idea that these ships can become basically targets for very sophisticated Chinese and Russian aircraft. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. The U.S. is not positioned in Asia, even with these maneuvers going on in South Korea now. Even if Japan does do some rearmament, Australia is a decade away from having these nuclear subs, but the confrontation is being pushed for now. So you have to ask yourself, military people who are saying these things, are they completely insane? Or are they responding to the prodding they're getting from the corporate directors and the intelligence networks and the think tanks that are preparing them for their post-military career future? Because it doesn't make sense. You talked about what would happen if there's a provocation and Russia decided to extend the fight to NATO. Well, the Russians said their first target would be London because they know much of this provocation is coming from London. Now, is that really what the British want? Certainly the English people don't want that. What do they think, that Putin is not serious? That if he feels a threat, an existential threat to Russia, that he won't strike out? Here in Germany, you have people walking around in a post-holiday fog. Kids are back in school this week. You talk to people at parents' nights and things of that sort, and all they want to talk about is World Cup football, and they're in a dream world. That's why Barbara Tuchman wrote the book, The Guns of August, because wars start when leaders are on vacation and people are in fantasy world. I just read, you probably saw the video of the Finnish prime minister dancing like she was either drunk or on cocaine. Macron is on the beaches and he's catching flack from the French military over that. This is an extremely dangerous moment in world history. It requires some clear thinking. Can we get that from Biden? I really don't think so. Unfortunately, the people who could think better on this, including someone like Trump, is now tied up with this Mar-a-Lago case. He's tied up with the legal cases where they're trying to make sure that he's taken out as a potential presidential candidate in 2024. So there's an effort to distract and disorient and divert attention from a potential suicidal strategy revolved around degrading Russia, using Ukraine as the weapon for that, the proxy for that. So, I think when you talk about what's the strategy from the West, that's a misnomer. If there is a strategy, it's a strategy that was cooked up in an insane asylum.
I'll just put forward the suggestion that I've seen written in other places, that this Ukraine area is the greatest black soil farming land on the planet, and that BlackRock and Vanguard are buying it up. And what is the best way to make money off a war is, to just destroy everything and then buy it cheap and then build it back up. And then secondly, you may have seen William Engdahl's reporting that this grain that they're going to be shipping out is GMO grain, which is illegal to grow in Ukraine, but that in order to make a deal, they made some kind of a deal that they could use GMO grain. Well, all of that is just to say, you say, well, when the leaders are going on vacation and Biden's gone, Harris is in Hawaii, I think, uh, and these what's really driving the policy is clearly not the leadership. It's
No,
people
that's
behind the
yeah.
scene, and that's where I get back to BlackRock and Vanguard. To what extent do you think that BlackRock and Vanguard are driving the agenda?
Well, this is something that Putin brought up in his Moscow speech. I mean, he basically said that this is not what they're doing is not in the interest of the American people, not in the interest of the American economy. And what you're talking about with the sale of land, this goes back to an order from Zelensky at the end of 2021, where he carried out what he called land reform. And they drove Ukrainians off the land by raising taxes and by reappraising the land as more expensive so that the taxes would go up. And then who came in? It was Cargill, Archer Daniels Midland, the grain cartels backed with money from BlackRock, Vanguard, and a few other banks. This is turning the Ukrainian people into slaves, taking their land away. And of course, what does this immediately bring up in people's mind? Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. You're not going to own anything. We're going to own it all. This is part of the Great Reset. Now, this is where the policy is coming from. Biden isn't making policy. Blinken isn't making policy. Blinken comes from the foreign policy team that was created by Madeleine Albright and Zbigniew Brzezinski, which, to be perfectly honest, the two of them were genocidal lunatics. As Albright herself admitted when she said 500,000 Iraqi children dying of hunger because of sanctions, well, that's a small price to pay. So you're talking about people who literally are anti-human, almost satanic in their outlook. Now, the question is, how do they make policy that ends up moving the institutions of government? And this is where you see the role of the financial cartels, the grain cartels, buying the Congress, buying the institutions, and controlling the permanent bureaucracy of government. I mentioned this earlier. One of the things we're looking at is something that is being done in the United Kingdom to shape the way people think about policy. They set up something called the Behavioral Insight Team inside the UK government. Now, behavioral insight is part of this idea that you can't change people's minds to go against what they think, but you can nudge them. You can move them a little bit. You can get them to change their behavior. And this behavioral insight team targeted the civil servant grouping in the British government. Well, we have the same thing. This is what Cass Sunstein was. You remember him, the aide to Obama? His wife is Samantha Power, who was one of the key people behind the responsibility to protect. She now runs the Agency for International Development, which is funding things like the Ukrainian Center for Countering Disinformation. This is their goal: soft power. Change the way people think. Convince them you can't change anything, but you can tolerate it. If you submit it, you'll get a few crumbs. Submit to it. This is what they're trying to do to developing sector countries, and these countries, to their great credit, are saying no. I'll give you another example of what I think is the true American spirit. You may have heard about this in the last week or so. The US government was making the point that the money that was seized from Afghanistan will be delivered to the families of the victims of 9/11 who won court settlements and awards in court. The families of 9/11 victims issued a statement saying, "We don't want that money. That's not your money. That's not our money. That's the money of the Afghan people who are hungry because of the failed policies of the United States." And it wasn't Afghanistan that was responsible for 9/11. If you want to look for responsibility, look at the Saudis and their connection to the Cheney Acts and the Bush administration. So the family members of 9/11, instead of saying, okay, we'll take our $500,000 or our $1 million payoff, said, take your money and shove it. We want justice. That's the American response. And for people who are cynical about the Americans' ability to stand up and fight, I point to the family members of 9/11, the victims of 9/11 and that incident, which just happened last week. I don't know what Biden's reaction was to it, but that to me is the real American spirit. Now, how do we generate that when you're dealing with things such as these behavioral insight teams that are literally psychological brainwashers who are conducting experiments on how to nudge people to accept things that are unacceptable? You know, I was talking to one of the people who's been doing this investigation, and I said, what are they going to do? Convince people in England that they don't need to eat? And he said, you'd be surprised what they're saying. And then you look at this whole question of getting people to eat bugs. Now, it's an extreme example, but how many people actually wake up in the morning and say, I'd like a breakfast side order of crickets with my pancakes? Well, you're not going to get pancakes, so you better eat the crickets. And that's the reality of the potential dictatorship that's coming with this great reset if we don't change it.
Being in Ireland and the events of 100 years ago and less, but the attitude of the British government to the Irish people over the 19th century and even into the 20th century and even up to now is one of disdain, is one of, these are serfs. They're naturally serfs. They're never going to be more than serfs. And you saw the result in what they call the Great Famine, which our friend Chris Fogarty has written a book arguing and convincingly stating that it was more than a famine. It was a Holocaust, and not to take the word away from the horrible Jewish Holocaust, but to think of it in terms of a famine could be accidental, but a Holocaust is intentional. And I see that what one of the subtexts that we've been talking about this morning is, are these people idiots, or are they really that evil? And this,
John, you talk about the Irish famine, and you look at people like Thomas Malthus. You look at the people who were making British policy, the Corn Laws and things of that sort.
Yeah.
They knew the effect it was going to have.
Mm-hmm.
They knew they were going to kill people. But they argued, as Malthus did. Malthus said, if you have a stagnant pond that could be a breeding ground for disease, don't clean it, because you need these diseases to limit the population. This is the policy of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, of the economic hitmen, that the problem in the developing sector is too many people, not that they've had their resources stolen from them and their labor stolen from them, but that there are too many of them and they're too ignorant. And so this is where LaRouche had said many, many times, don't underestimate the actual evil mentality of the people who think they're the masters of the universe. That many of these people qualify for the term satanic in the way they look at the human race. And one of those people is Prince Charles, who's right at the center of the economic restructuring. I was going to bring this up earlier when you brought up BlackRock, but toward the end of this week, there's the annual Jackson Hole, Wyoming Federal Reserve retreat, where the masters of the universe get together to compare notes on how things are going and where they're going next. This was the conference in September 2019, actually August 2019, where the Great Reset idea was fully unveiled. People like Klaus Schwab and others have been talking about it from the earlier part of the decade, but it was actually in the August-September period of 2019 where they went into the plan to use a compact among bankers and financial institutions to withhold funds from any company with a carbon footprint. In other words, any company that produces anything, and force all the credit into a green financial bubble, which they were talking about at that time as a $130 trillion potential bubble controlled by the likes of BlackRock and Vanguard. And of course, what happened right after that conference? In mid-September 2019, the overnight loan window that the banks had for their best customers, the so-called repurchase window, shut down. The banks were no longer making those loans. So the Fed stepped in. And between September of 2019 and the end of January 2019, they ponied up over $11 trillion. Virtually all of it went to a handful of banks and investment banks, including Citibank, Bank of America, JP Morgan Chase, Nomura Securities, the banks that owned the New York Fed that was providing the liquidity. And then what did they do? They blamed the inflation on COVID and then on Putin, when it was the policies of the Federal Reserve from 2008 forward, but then especially after 2019. So the same people who did that in 2019 are meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming this weekend. And hopefully next time we get together, I'll have a full report for you on what went on at that meeting, because their intent is to push ahead in spite of the opposition. And possibly that means we should be very wary of wars in Africa, of an expansion of NATO. The French are leaving some of French West Africa. What's going to replace it? NATO. And this is one of the things the African Union is worried about. Assassination, various kinds of so-called natural disasters. So I think we've got to be really alert to what these evil networks are capable of doing.
It took me, I was well into my 60s before I was really willing to look at it as evil, as these people are satanic, they are evil, they are trying to start wars. Their happiest state is war. They think war is the natural, one of the famous ones is that war is the natural state of mankind. And
but they never fight it.
No, but that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, to get people to understand that Joe Biden, maybe he looks like an idiot, but he didn't get where he is by being an idiot. He is a tool, and I don't think it's possible for us to analyze the situation by still calling people idiots. We've got to start calling them evil or satanic or and the whole idea of population reduction has got to be faced, because that's one of their primary goals is to reduce the population of the planet severely. And then you have this guy that I can't stand to look at from Israel named Yuval Hariri, I think his name is. Maybe I got his name wrong. You know who I'm talking about? The guy that's saying, oh, well, there's 7 billion excess people on this planet. We don't need them all. We're going to replace them with robots and AI. We have to call these people out. We have to face it. Am I missing something here? If we keep calling them idiots and stupid, then we're never going to win.
Well, the only ones who are idiots and stupid are us if we give them the benefit of the doubt and say, well, maybe they are miscalculating. If so, they've been miscalculating for the last 50 years, 60 years. In a sense, if you look at the tradition they represent, the imperial tradition, they've been miscalculating since the time of Babylon and Rome. So, the Oxford is a repository of studies of language cultures and their susceptibilities, national studies, to figure out how to manipulate people, how to control them. And creating this doubt that, well, maybe they really do believe there are too many people, and maybe the Earth's carrying capacity, we're about to overwhelm it and we can't do that. It's throwing out everything we should know about culture, history, and science. Mankind, we're now over close to 8 billion people on the planet because of the advances in science and technology. There's no reason that can't continue. The only reason it's not continuing is the desire of these Malthusians to wipe out 7 or so billion people. Prince Philip said at a conference of the Swiss insurance companies. He once said, if I were to be reincarnated, I'd like to come back as a deadly disease to reduce the population of the world to 1 billion people. This is what Prince Charles believes. This is what Klaus Schwab believes. Schwab says the impulse to destroy the planet is people's desire for a better life. Well, how do you change that? All of us, I think one of the things that makes us human is two factors. We ultimately have to come to terms with our own mortality, but we also want to have our life have a meaning that goes on after we die. What if you take that away from people and say the only meaning of life is your immediate pleasures? And that's where you get the drug legalization, you get the chaos that's being unleashed, the sense of lack of desire for improvement, the acceptance of what some people call idiocy, but I think we're really pointing out is deliberate policy. And this has been something that I learned from Lyndon LaRouche over the almost 50 years that I was his spokesman. You know, that you have to put aside a nostalgia and recognize the hard facts that you do have evil people out there. They may not have horns that show, they may not have a tail or carry a pitchfork around, but the work they're doing is to depopulate. It's like the bankers who funded Hitler. It's like your old buddies, the Dulles brothers, you know, who paraded around as pious Christians. Well, you know, this is something, it's a hard lesson to learn. But I think the other part of it is to recognize that most people do want to do what's right. But sometimes it's not easy or convenient to do that. And it's been made more difficult to do what's right. But we still have to point the way and give people the hard truths and hope that enough of them will step up to take on the responsibility the way someone like Diane Sayre is doing, or like Scott Ritter is doing. You know, we need these kinds of heroes to step forward and say to people, don't succumb to the promises that you can have an easy life if you just go along to get along.
I'll also mention Daniel Burke, who was under some serious attack on Twitter yesterday, and he's also one of the people that I've gotten to know through the offices of the late Marcia Malouk and the Schiller Institute. I once again would urge people to investigate Diane Sayre's campaign. Anything we can do to shake up the Chuck Schumer team, we need to do. And I think Diane is an honest person, and that's enough for me at this point to have somebody honest in that Senate seat. So I would hardly endorse Diane. If you're a New York voter, please check into her campaign.
Well, and if you're not from New York, you can still go to New York and help the campaign. And you can check that out at SARE for Senate, SARE for Senate. And I'll give a plug to what I continue to do. I'm continuing to put out my daily update. It's still 10 to 12 minutes. It's the antidote to the mainstream brainwashing behavior modification that you get. And you can find that at LaRoucheOrganization.com. And if people want to be in touch with me, I haven't given out my email address recently with you, John, but I used to get lots of emails from your listeners. So I'd like to start that again, because you have a very interesting and educated group of people who watch you. So you can contact me at harleysch@gmail.com. That's HARLEYSCH@gmail.com. And you know, you want to criticize me? Fine. Let's have a dialogue. That's how the world's going to, hopefully, how we'll save ourselves.
Indeed. And well, there's a little bit of echo hitting us here. I don't know what's causing that. Someone pointed it out in the chat. But anyway, we're about to the end of the hour, so we'll just push through it. In my view, Lyndon LaRouche had the answers, and I think you folks do have, as far as the economic questions. the analysis has been done, and we know what must be done to straighten out our economic problems. It's a question of willingness. It's a question of, can we, number one, educate the American people as to how bad it is, and what will happen if we don't. We got to do something. It's a boiling frog situation. Y'all do have great answers, but you're under attack, just like President Trump is under attack. All of the voices that try to bring reason to the table end up getting under attack and quashed. So resources like Harley's every morning, it usually appears about 9 a.m. Eastern time. A daily update is a great way to start your day. So I certainly do enjoy it, and I recommend it to everyone else.
John, it sort of reminds me, what you were just describing is the situation where someone's driving the car, and he's driving very fast, and someone says, "Do you know where we are?" And he says, "No, but we're making good time." People don't know where we are, but we're heading toward oblivion at a very fast clip. And we have to put on the brakes, do some thinking, go out and talk to people. How hard is it? We're losing the ability to engage in real social intercourse, dialogue. And that's part of the intention behind the AI and the Zuckerbergs and others, maybe not Zuckerberg himself, but the people who designed these things, is to break the social connections that have helped mankind civilize itself. And I think these kinds of discussions, I cherish our talks every other week, because I don't talk to that many people who are open to ideas as you are, John. And I think that's one of the reasons you have very loyal supporters. And we need more people like you.
Well, you're too kind, and I would say the same back to you. And my regards to Helga. She's also a target of these blacklisters. I trust she's rises above it as usual.
She's got a birthday coming up in a couple of days.
Well, give her my compliments and best wishes for a very happy birthday.
Thank you. I will.
And thank you, Harley, and thank you, everyone, for being with us this morning here at McDuff Lives. I will see you guys tomorrow. Good day.